Welcome back to part 4 of our JavaScript variable series. Now, we're finally going to dive deep into one of the most crucial concepts in JavaScript, and that's scope and hoisting. Understanding scope and hoisting isn't just important, it's absolutely essential for becoming a confident JavaScript developer. These concepts explain why your code behaves the way it does, and mastering them will help you avoid common pitfalls and write more predictable, reliable code. Let's get started. Now, let's first understand what is scope. Scope is simply where in your code can you access a particular variable or function. Think of scope like visibility rules. It determines what parts of your code can see and use specific variables. Let's understand this with real-world analogy. Now, let's imagine that your house has different rooms, such as kitchen, bedroom, and living room. Only people who are in the kitchen can use kitchen items, and that same goes for bedroom. Only people who have permission can enter. As for your living room, everyone can access and shared items. Scope works the same way with variables in your code. In simple terms, scope determines where in your code you can see or use specific variable and function. Let's see some code example. In this code, what do you think would get printed? Well, first it printed Jane and then Sarah, but why? Why we get Sarah outside the function and Jane inside the function? This is where scope comes into play. What really happening is, whenever we put a variable outside any block or function, like our name equals Sarah, it becomes global. It means that that variable can be used or accessed everywhere in our code. Think of it like putting something in the middle of a room where everyone can see it. Now, here's the thing. When we do console.log outside the function, JavaScript looks around and found that global name variable with Sarah in it. That's why it printed welcome Sarah. Now, let us see the tricky part. So, what happens inside the function? Well, when we call greetUser function, JavaScript sees that it needed to do console.log name, so it started to look around for name variable, and it found the closest name variable with Jane in it. And that's why it printed the hello Jane. The key thing is JavaScript always pick up the closest variable first. But you might be thinking, if JavaScript print the closest variable first, then in our previous code, why this console.log doesn't print the welcome Jane? Because hierarchically, the variable inside and function is the closest for this console.log. So why print the welcome Sarah instead of welcome John? Let me give you an answer. The key thing here is when we put a variable inside any function, that variable becomes local to that function. What does this mean? Is that variable is only available inside that function. When console.log is executed outside the function, JavaScript started a search for the name variable within the current scope. It successfully locates the globally declared name variable, which holds the value Sarah. The reason Jane is not printed is due to variables declared inside a function, such as name with the value Jane, are become local variables. They can only be accessed and utilized within that specific function. Outside the function, these local variables are not accessible, and JavaScript will instead look for a variable with the same name in a broader, accessible scope, such as the global scope in this instance. Now, let's see the last part of the scope, the block scope. First, let's see what is block. A block in JavaScript refers to any section of code which is enclosed by curly braces. In this example, the highlighted section is block scope, and there are many examples such as if block, for loop, function, object, etc. Let's see what is block scope. When we declare a variable using let and const keyword and put it inside in curly braces, then that variables can only be accessed inside those curly braces. If we try to access it outside those curly braces, then JavaScript will throw an error. And in JavaScript, you can also access variables which is inside an outer block in an inner block. This is called lexical scoping, but the vice versa is not true. Let me show you why using var inside blocks can catch even experienced developers off guard. We know that with let and const, variables stay inside their blocks. But var, it plays by completely different rules. Let's see this example. The var variable just escaped the block like it was never there. This is because var is function scoped, not block scoped. Even though you might be declare a variable with var inside a block, but JavaScript sees it at the top of the function. In case if there is no function like in our example, then JavaScript see var declaration on top of global scope. It is only because of this behavior we can use var even outside the block. But today developers prefer to use let or const because it is very much safer. This is it. Now, let's summarize all the things we learned. Is scope. In simple terms, scope determines where in your code you can access or use particular variable. It simply answers the question, where in your code you can access this variable and function. Further, scope is divided into 3 parts. First is global scope. Second, local scope or function scope. And last, block scope. Let's summarize each of them. So, if you put any line of code or any variable outside the block or function, they become global, and this variable can be used from everywhere in our code. Local scope. This is one of the very easy part of scope. So, if you put any variable inside a function, then that variable becomes local to that function, and those variables can only be accessed inside that function. And last is block scope. Any section of your code enclosed by curly braces or become block scope, like if, else, for loop, object, etc. If you use let or const inside and block, then those variable can only be accessed inside those block. But for var, block scope doesn't exist. So we can even access var variable outside the block. And there's one more thing about block is that inner block can access variables from outer block, but vice versa is not true. This is it for today. In next video, we're going to learn about hoisting. Until then, keep coding.